Hello everybody, and happy third night of Hanukkah. I hope you're enjoying yourself and you are eating lots of oily treats. One thing that I always think of, just like as the Hanukkah begins to become fuller and fuller, I always think of like taking a picture of it. And then you do. But it's never as beautiful. It's never as beautiful. And it really tells us something, because beauty itself is a sign of virtue. Now, you may not really... You may think that I'm saying something else, but in classic philosophical literature, beauty and virtue are, if not synonymous, they are synonyms. And the reason is because when you say that something is beautiful, you're assigning a value to it. You're assigning a hierarchy of beauty. Something is more beautiful than another because it has certain features that you prefer. And the philosophers, they bring this down to even behavior. One set of behaviors is more beautiful than another, and what this means is that set of behaviors is more moral. In Christian thought, this is called natural philosophy, or natural ethics, or the natural law. But of course, the Christians, what they have done, and not just the Christians, the Jews as well, Philo of Alexandria, for instance, is one of the earlier proponents of this idea, but they all include in this idea of natural law one law that is even beyond that, which is the divine law, which is the perfect law that God gave us. So when you look at the Hanukkah and you see it as beautiful, and then you take a picture and you see it as not as beautiful, you just can't capture the brightness, the shimmering light, the beauty of it. You're painting a very relevant picture. You see, we all look at the world in one degree or another through a picture, through a low resolution version of the beauty that is the world that God created. And this is something that Jesus understood in his sermon for Hanukkah. So when Jesus got up in Jerusalem on Hanukkah in the winter, he was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. And so the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe, because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." Now this little sermon is the Shemesh candle. It is the one candle that's separate from all others that enlightens all the other candles. This is a bit of the Spirit of Christ that is pointing the way towards ultimate beauty, towards ultimate moral truth. But the one thing that they're asking him is, are you another Judas Maccabeus? But the issue here is their idea of Judas Maccabeus, their idea of what the Messiah will be, is very different than the idea that Jesus has in mind. You see, they think that the Messiah is going to come as another Judas, cleanse the temple, get rid of all of the heretics, and conquer the world and enslave all of the Gentiles. All the Gentiles who are enslaving them. But Jesus understands in the story of Hanukkah that there are both bad Gentiles and good Gentiles. He understands that part of his job is to redeem those Gentiles who will be redeemed. Now, a first century Jew is very unlikely to understand that. Especially because they're being oppressed by the same Gentiles that the early Christians were attempting to bring into the fold. If you're oppressed, you don't want your oppressors to be saved. At least, not in any worldly way. But Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice. And I have other sheep beyond just this flock." Additionally, he says you'll know them by their fruits. And what does that mean? Well, you'll know the believers, the good Gentiles, those who have been redeemed by Christ, by their fruit. But more than that, and this is where the higher resolution, more nuanced picture comes in, there will be unredeemed Gentiles. You have a little bit of good in them, and you can take that good and incorporate it into your faith. You see, all goodness comes from God. And so if goodness is found in the Gentile, it's not that he just invented it. It's not pagan goodness. There's no such thing as pagan goodness. But that is an echo of God's spark within them. And so, in the story of the Maccabees, there are good Gentiles and there are bad Gentiles. Of course, the bad Gentiles, the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes, they come in, they're trying to subjugate the Jewish people and tell them that they can no longer serve the God of their ancestors. They have to break the covenant of their God. They go into the temple, they make it unclean. They erect the abomination of desolation. These are bad Gentiles. And Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus and his brothers Simeon and Jonathan, they go in, they capture cities that are surrounding Jerusalem. They finally are able to get to Jerusalem and capture it, and capture the temple, and they tear down the old altar that has been defiled, and they build the new one, and they cleanse the temple. And then another priest comes in. It can't have been more than a few years later, after their triumphal victory, when another priest comes and he speaks good words. He says he'll protect them, but as soon as he meets them, he kills them. Now the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus, Simeon, Jonathan, they're able to escape and they're able to continue their campaign, but they've found rot within. And so this tells them there are wicked Jews at the same time as righteous Jews. Now they knew this because the entire revolt began with a wicked Jew coming up and trying to sacrifice to Zeus in Modin. But even after the cleansing of the temple, they're still around. Your job isn't finished when you have pushed out the oppressive Gentile regime. But they understand another thing. Something that the first century Jews were very unlikely to understand, and that is that certain Gentile nations can be friends and allies. You see, while the Maccabean revolt was happening, there was another power across the water that was growing in strength. They were defeating the Gauls, they were defeating the Greeks, they were sending delegations near and far, and sending their army all over the world and defeating them, winning. Whom they decided to erect as king, they were king, and whom they decided to depose, they depose. If you are living in America right now, this sounds familiar. But through their victories and the battles that they win and all of the triumph that God gives them, and they're smashing their foes and all of that sort of stuff, the Maccabees look at it, and the author of First Maccabees, he writes about them, and he says that despite all of this, despite all of their victories and triumphs, not one of them puts on a crown or wears purple as a mark of pride. But instead, they build for themselves a Senate chamber, and every day 320 senators constantly deliberate concerning the people to govern them well. They trust one man each year to rule over them and to control all their land. They all heed the one man, and there is no envy or jealousy among them. Of course, I'm talking about the Roman Empire. Now, the Maccabees, they see this empire, and they understand that historically, these people have been good to their friends, and they have been bad to their enemies. So if we make friends with these guys, that might go well. Now, you might think, well, it didn't go well, because look at history. But the same argument could be made about the Davidic kings. Was God wrong for establishing a covenant with David just because Ahab came, just because Manasseh came? No. He was right because David was right with the Lord. It's not about Manasseh. The covenant was made with David. And at this point, the Maccabees understood that the Romans were not evil. They were pagan, but they had some goodness in them. And so this little snapshot of Roman history from an outsider's perspective tells us that they were seen as a generally good force. At the very least, they had this in common with the Jews, that they deliberated to make righteous laws. One of the core tenets of judgment in Deuteronomy. And so the Maccabees, they send a delegation to the Romans to see whether or not the Romans truly are going to be good to the Jewish people, or whether or not, or whether they are going to try to subjugate them in the same way the Greeks will. The Romans like this delegation, and what do? They send a treaty. Now, if you're familiar with ancient treaties, you might be thinking, suzerain vassal? No. They send a treaty of friendship. Your enemies will be my enemies, your friends will be my friends, and vice versa. But the astounding thing about this, if the Romans thought they could just come in and subjugate the Jews at this point, they could have. But what they do is they limit themselves. In their treaty, they tell the Jews that if anything wants to be changed in this treaty, both parties have to agree. Israel and Rome. They saw the Jews, at least they saw Israel, not as a lesser nation, legally speaking, but they saw them as a sovereign state, not as part of their empire at this point. So at this point in time, they were Gentiles, but they had some righteous characteristics. And those righteous characteristics, the Jews were able to incorporate into their own faith and their own way of doing things. And this is what Jesus understands. This is what Jesus understands when the people ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" on Hanukkah. He says, "You're not ready for the Messiah on Hanukkah because Judas made treaties with foreign powers that are good. You don't want me to do that. You want me to annihilate every foreign power. And that's not what I'm coming to do. You see, I'm going to redeem many Gentiles. And you're not ready for that. So I can't tell you that I'm the Messiah." Now, because there are righteous people in every people group and there are wicked people in every people group, one thing that we have to ask as we are rededicating ourselves to the Lord during this Feast of Rededication, have we been acting as righteous people over the last year? Have we been seeing everything through a low-resolution picture, black and white, and making split heuristic judgments against people that really ought not to be judged? Or do we see everybody as potentially righteous people if they just accept Christ? Is Christ sufficient? Is that how you see things? Or is it Christ plus something else? No, Christ is sufficient. And on this Feast of Rededication, I just hope that if you are unable to see the good in people, if you're unable to see the Christ in people, or if you're unable to see the potential in people, I would say that's something you should rededicate to the Lord, because He sees the Christ in people. He's not willing that anyone should perish. So with that, Happy Hanukkah, Chag Sameach. This was a bit more of a difficult one because I understand that for some reason there's controversy in finding something good in something that's not the Judeo-Christian faith. But if you celebrate Hanukkah, then implicitly you celebrate the goodness found in everybody, not just the Judeo-Christian faith. In fact, if you're a Christian and you read the Bible, then there is Tzor, there's Hiram, there is Naaman the Assyrian. I mean, there are countless examples of Gentiles who do not fully convert, who the Bible sees as righteous. So with that, I pray that every one of us listening to this gets right with the Lord, rededicates ourselves to Him, and has a happy Hanukkah. Chag Sameach.